Hey friends, welcome back to the Irony Shelf. Tonight we continue Volume 2 with Saki's The Open Window. They say the country is a place of restorative peace, where nothing ever happens and no one ever changes. And yet, at the Sappleton estate, a polite cup of tea may come with a side of the most unsettling hospitality. Now fix a stiff gin and tonic and meet the nervous newcomer. In the heart of Surrey, England, in 1911, the morning air is heavy with the scent of damp earth. Stepping out onto a stone terrace, the sun is just beginning to burn through a thick fog. The grass beneath the balustrade is an impossibly deep emerald, wet with a dew that smells of moss and ancient stone. Everything here is quiet, save for the distant, rhythmic thwack of a croquet mallet and the morning call of a blackbird. It feels like a sanctuary, a place where the jagged edges of the city are smoothed over by miles of manicured hedges and rose gardens that have never known a stray leaf. But as you breathe in the crisp, cool air, you realize that the peace is somewhat performative. The wild here has been conquered, trimmed into topiaries, and confined to gravel paths. You are a guest in a house of 100 rooms, with each being a gallery of expectations. It is a restorative trap, a place where you come to relax, only to find that some prefer to play the social game even harder under the open sky. In this garden of earthly delights, the most dangerous thing you encounter isn't a predator, but an awkward silence. And here, dear listener, we begin our story. "My aunt will be down shortly, Mr. Nuttall," said a very self-possessed young lady of 15. "Until then, you must try and put up with me." Frampton Nuttall endeavoured to say the something appropriate, the kind of polite flattery which would please the niece of the moment, without offending the aunt who was yet to come. Privately, he doubted more than ever whether these formal visits to total strangers would do much to help the nerve cure he was supposed to be undergoing. "I know exactly how it will be," his sister had said when he was preparing to leave for this rural retreat. "You will bury yourself down there and not speak to a living soul, and your nerves will be worse than ever from the solitude. I shall just give you letters of introduction to everyone I know there. Some of them, as far as I can remember, were quite nice." Frampton wondered whether Mrs. Sappleton, the lady he was now visiting with a letter of introduction, came into the nice category. "Do you know many people around here?" asked the niece, when she judged that they had had enough silence. "Hardly a soul. My sister was staying here, at the rectory, you know, some 4 years ago. And she gave me letters of introduction to some of the people here," said Frampton. He made the last statement in a tone of clear regret. "Then you know practically nothing about my aunt?" pursued the self-possessed young lady. "Only her name and address," admitted the caller. He was wondering whether Mrs. Sappleton was married or widowed. An indefinable feeling about the room seemed to suggest masculine habitation. "Her great tragedy happened exactly 3 years ago," said the child. "That would have been after your sister's time." "Her tragedy?" asked Frampton. Somehow, in this restful country spot, tragedies seemed out of place. "You may wonder why we keep that window wide open on an October afternoon," said the niece, pointing toward a large French window that opened onto a lawn. "It is quite warm for the time of the year," said Frampton. "But does that window have anything to do with the tragedy?" Out through that window, 3 years ago today, her husband and her 2 young brothers went off for their hunting trip. They never came back. In crossing the moor to their favourite hunting ground, They were all three engulfed in a treacherous piece of bog. It had been a terribly wet summer, you know, and places that were safe in other years gave way suddenly, without warning. Their bodies were never recovered. That was the worst part of it. Here the child's voice lost its certain tone and became unsteadily human. Poor aunt always thinks they will come back some day. They and the little brown spaniel that was lost with them, and walk right in through that window just as they used to do. That is why the window is kept open every evening until it is quite dusk. Poor dear aunt. She has often told me how they went out, her husband with his white raincoat over his arm, and Ronnie, her youngest brother, singing a playful song to tease her, because she said it upset her nerves. Do you know, sometimes on still, quiet evenings like this, I almost get a creepy feeling that they will all walk in through that window. She broke off with a little shudder. It was a relief to Frampton when the aunt bustled into the room with a flurry of apologies for being late in making her appearance. "I hope Vera has been entertaining you," she said. "She has been very interesting," said Frampton. "I hope you don't mind the open window," said Mrs. Sappleton briskly. "My husband and brothers will be home any moment from their hunt, and they always come in this way. They've been out for snipe in the marshes today, so they'll make a fine mess over my poor carpets. So like you men, isn't it?" She rattled on cheerfully about the hunt, the scarcity of birds, and the prospects for duck in the winter. To Frampton it was all purely horrible. He made a desperate, but only partially successful effort to turn the conversation to a less haunting topic. He was conscious that his hostess was giving him only a fragment of her attention, and her eyes were constantly straying past him to the open window and the lawn beyond. It was certainly an unfortunate coincidence that he should have paid his visit on this tragic anniversary. "The doctors agree in ordering me complete rest, an absence of mental excitement, and the avoidance of any semblance of violent physical exercise," announced Frampton, who laboured under the tolerably widespread delusion that total strangers and chance acquaintances are hungry for the smallest detail of one's ailments and infirmities, their cause and cure. "On the matter of diet," he continued, "they are not in such complete agreement." "No?" said Mrs. Sappleton, in a voice which only suppressed a yawn at the last moment. Then she suddenly brightened into alert attention, but not to what Frampton was saying. "Here they are at last," she cried, "just in time for tea, and don't they look as though they were muddy up to the eyes?" Frampton shuddered slightly, and turned toward the niece with a look intended to convey sympathetic understanding. The child was staring out through the open window with dazed horror in her eyes. In a cold shock of nameless fear, Frampton swung around in his seat and looked in the same direction. In the deepening twilight, 3 figures were walking across the lawn toward the window. They all carried guns under their arms, and one of them was also carrying a white raincoat draped over his shoulders. A tired brown spaniel kept close at their heels. Noiselessly they neared the house, and then a hoarse young voice chanted out of the dusk, "I said, Bertie, why do you bound about?" Frampton grabbed wildly at his stick and hat. The hall door, the gravel driveway, and the front gate were barely noticed stages in his headlong retreat. A cyclist coming along the road had to swerve into the hedge to avoid a collision. "Here we are, my dear," said the bearer of the white raincoat, coming in through the window. "Fairly muddy, but most of it's dry. Who was that who bolted as we came up?" A most extraordinary man, that Mr. Nuttall. He could only talk about his illnesses, said Mrs. Sappleton, and dashed off without a word of goodbye or apology when you arrived. One would think he had seen a ghost. I imagine it was the spaniel, said the niece calmly. He told me he had a horror of dogs. He was once hunted into a cemetery along the banks of the Ganges by a pack of wild dogs, and had to spend the night in a newly dug grave, with the creatures snarling and snapping and foaming just above him, enough to make anyone lose their nerve. Romance, at short notice, was her specialty. And here, dear listener, we conclude our reading of The Open Window, written by Saki, and respectfully adapted for the modern listener. Hector Hugh Munro, the author behind the pen name of Saki, imbued many of his younger characters, like the mischievous Vera, with a cleverness that reflects Munro's own upbringing, in a highly structured, traditional English household. Raised by his aunts in a world of strict domestic expectations, he became an expert at navigating the quiet, polite layers of family life. This environment shaped his understanding of the home as a place of great imaginative potential, seeing this theatre as a place of strategic deception, where the quietest person in the room often held the most power. In The Open Window, we see Munro's mastery of the tall tale. He understood that his contemporary audience enjoyed the traditional English ghost story, and he used that familiarity to guide them toward a more modern conclusion, through the sting of human cleverness. His method was empowering, suggesting that the rigid manners of the adult world are often the perfect canvas for a brilliant, creative mind. He remains one of the few authors who could turn the simple ceremony of afternoon tea into a masterpiece of suspense and wit. The Open Window first appeared in the Westminster Gazette on November 18, 1911. Like many of Saki's most famous works, it was a lightning strike of fiction, brief, perfectly paced, and designed to leave the reader questioning the very ground they stood on. It was later anchored as a centerpiece in his 1914 collection, Beasts and Super Beasts, published just as the long Edwardian summer was coming to a close, with the onset of the Great War. The inspiration for this particular story was the Edwardian obsession with rest cures for nervous exhaustion. In 1911, it was common for the urban elite to be sent to quiet country houses to recover from the stresses of London life. Saki, ever the observer of social tropes, saw the inherent irony in sending a fragile man like Frampton Nuttall to a house full of strangers. He realized that the pursuit of peace can be utilized as a mask for the most creative forms of psychological mischief. While Vera is a fictional creation, she represents a recurring Saki archetype, the romancer at short notice. This was a term Saki used to describe the type of brilliant, often bored individual who could weave a complex, artistically imaginative tale from the simplest of stage props, in this case, an open French window. If you, too, find a certain charm in the art of the ironic and the unexpected, we invite you to subscribe and join us. It is your support that allows the Irony Shelf to regularly curate these volumes. Thank you for listening. I look forward to sharing our next story with you very soon.